What are you going to do if they spit in your face? If they hit you? If they knock you down? An old man asked me. You going to hit back? I'm going to try not to. The old man shook his head. We can't use you. You can't use me. Why the hell not? Mr. Gregory, you got to know you're not going to fight back. I couldn't believe I was standing on a Greenwood street and listening to an old Mississippi Negro, a man I had come down to do a favor for, tell me he can't use me. I told him I'd have to think about it. He nodded his nappy old head and said he'd be back and shuffled away. I thought about it, and the more I thought, the more I realized how beautiful this thing really was. It was my second day in Greenwood. Monday morning, Jim Sanders and I had caught the 8 o'clock flight from New York to Memphis. The plane was filled. I didn't find out why until we landed and a man came over and said he was from the Department of Justice. How long are you going to be here, Mr. Gregory? I'm not staying in Memphis. I'm going on to Greenwood. I know that. We have orders to stay until you leave. A SNCC car picked us up and drove us to Greenwood. The press was there, the national magazines, the national television networks. They all asked me how long I was going to stay because they had to stay as long as I did. I couldn't believe it. Just for me? I didn't know until I got to Greenwood that the SNCC kids had announced to the press that I was expected. There were no demonstrations that first day, but I spoke at a crowded church rally that night. First, I answered all the charges that the local newspapers and public officials had made against me. I told them if they didn't believe I had brought 14,000 pounds of food, they should check the records of Delta Airlines. I told them that they weren't just dealing with Dick Gregory when they threatened to take all the Negroes off relief. They were dealing with America. They weren't big enough to threaten the whole country, and I'd be glad to take a lie detector test if the governor thought I was doing all this for publicity. Then I got on the Negro Church. There were 15 Negro churches in Greenwood, and only 2 of them had opened their doors to the demonstrators. I stood up there and told that crowd how the Negro preachers had brought us all the way to the battle lines and then had abandoned us. They were scared of losing their jobs, of having their churches bombed, of coming up empty in their collection plates. Our church was failing us in this battle for civil rights. It was the preachers' fault that whenever we made a gain we said, "Thank the United States Supreme Court," instead of saying, "Thank God." I looked at those people in that church, those beautiful people who were taking chances with their lives, with what little they had in the world. There wasn't a single Negro doctor in Greenwood. When Negroes demonstrate, they forfeit their medical attention. A Negro couldn't even afford to get sick, and they were going out, maybe to die, without any of their local Negro leaders. The preachers were scared, and the Negro school teachers and principals were too afraid for their jobs to go out in the streets. That night, standing in front of those people, I told them I'd be proud to lead them in demonstrations the next day. I really hadn't planned to lead the marching, but looking at those beautiful faces ready to die for freedom, I knew I couldn't do less. It was the next morning, while we were getting ready to march on the courthouse, that the old man came up to me. We were standing in front of the SNCC headquarters, about 50 of us and dozens of press and television people, when he told me he couldn't use me. By the time he came back again, my anger was gone. I understood what he meant. "We're ready to go, Mr. Gregory. What do you think?" "Okay, I'll do it." So we marched. Old people, kids, voter registration workers, women. We marched for 1 block, and every step of the way I was scared. waiting for that bullet to come from a rooftop, waiting for the car to come by and shoot me from the ground. The police stopped us after one block and told us we couldn't parade through the city, so we jumped into cars, made the 2-mile trip to the courthouse, and reassembled. We caught the cops off guard. They closed the courthouse early that day so no Negroes could register to vote. We started walking away in small groups, and suddenly there was a hand on my stomach, and I heard a cop say, "I oughta kill him." And the next thing I knew, someone had twisted my arm behind my back and was pushing me across the street. It was a Greenwood policeman. "Move on, nigger." "Thanks a million." "Thanks for what?" "Up north, police don't escort me across the street against a red light." "I said move on, nigger." "I don't know my way. I'm new in this town." The cop yanked on my arm and turned his head. "Send someone over to show this nigger where to go." They were pushing the marchers around. Dozens of regular policemen and auxiliary policemen with clubs and guns, and the press and the cameramen moved in and out of the crowds of white men and women and children standing on the street corners. I pulled one of my arms free and pointed at the crowd. "Ask that white woman over there to come here and show me where to go." The cop's face got red, and there was spittle at the corner of his mouth. All he could say was, "Nigger, dirty nigger." I looked at him. "Your mama's a nigger. Probably got more blood in her than I could ever hope to have in me." He dropped my other arm then and backed away, and his hand was on his gun. I thought he was going to explode, but nothing happened. I was sopping wet and too excited to be scared. We walked on back to the headquarters, the police yelling and shoving and harassing us all the way. We decided to march again that afternoon. I learned a lot that day. I felt the poisonous hate in an American city, a nice-looking little town that had a Confederate flag flying just as high as the American flag on the U.S. Post Office. I saw the beauty of those college kids from SNCC, day and night, around the clock, hardly ever sleeping or eating, as they sat in hot and dirty rooms teaching old Negroes how to read and write so they could pass the voting test. And I saw the Southern white man who has nothing between him and the lowest Negro except a segregated toilet. No wonder so many of them have shithouse ways. When we started back to the courthouse late that afternoon, a skinny old woman who said she was 98 years old came up to me. "Mr. Gregory, you be embarrassed if I walk downtown with you, me and my snuff box? I want to come down and be with you today. I don't mind dying." And so we marched again. Demonstrating in the South must be a little like being in a battle in a war. There's noise and confusion and pushing and quick huddles over strategy and running back and forth on both sides. You're never really sure of what's happening. You see snatches of things, hear sounds. You keep moving long after you're exhausted because you're too excited to know how tired you are. There are little victories that make you feel good for a while. That afternoon, we changed our route to the courthouse, and instead of marching through the center of town, we cut through a white neighborhood. It took the police almost a half an hour to catch up with us. "Dirty nigger." "Your mother's a nigger," I told the cop. "Damn black monkey." "Who you callin' monkey? Monkeys got thin lips. Monkeys got blue eyes and straight hair." "Just keep moving, boy. Just keep moving." The police seemed disorganized. They tried to break us up again, and one of them shoved a woman pretty hard. She stumbled and smashed her head against a brick wall and fell on the sidewalk. One of the SNCC workers couldn't stand that, and he turned on the cop. They dragged him off into a police car, and 5 cops climbed in after him and started working on his head and stomach. One of the cops was saying in a loud voice, mostly for the benefit of the other demonstrators, "George, give me my knife. I'm gonna cut the balls right off this little nigger. He ain't never gonna do nothing no more." Now I was at the head of the line and I refused to move an inch until they brought the SNCC kid back. Two cops grabbed me and threw me into the back of a police car. One of them asked the driver, "You want any help with this nigger?" "Why you always think a Negro's going to hurt somebody? Close the door and let this fool take me to jail." He slammed the door and walked away. The cop who was driving turned around and started slapping at my head. I held my hands up over my face. "Get your hands down, nigger!" He yelled and kept swinging at my head. He didn't do much damage. Then he started the car and drove about 3 blocks away from everything. He pulled the car over to the curb, and when he turned around, he was crying. "My God, what are you trying to do to me?" He sat in that car and he looked at me and he told me that when he went home at night, his kids looked at him funny, that they made him feel bad. I sat there and I couldn't believe I was hearing these words from a white cop who had been hitting me and niggering me a few minutes before. He said, "As right as you are, you're down here helping these people and I got to stop you. And I can't. And sometimes I think you're a better man than I am." He didn't take me to jail. He drove me back to registration headquarters. I got out of the car and handed him $2. "What's this for?" "I always tip chauffeurs. Hell, if you don't take me to jail, you're my chauffeur." I got into a SNCC car and rushed back to the demonstration. When I climbed out, the police commissioner, Hammond, came right over. "Boy, what you come back here for?" "Hammond, anytime you arrest me, you better carry me to jail, because if you don't, that's kidnapping, and that's a federal offense." A little cop came over. "Nigger, you want to go to jail?" I said, "Come here, boy, let me tell you something. I could take you to Chicago today and let you walk through my home, then come back here and walk through your home. And out of the two of us, you know which one was the nigger." Then the cops turned their backs and walked away, leaving us there on the corner. The parade was over, and we did exactly what they had been screaming at us to do. We broke up into twos and threes and went in different directions. That night, Jim Sanders and I drove 50 miles to a mass meeting in Clarksdale. There were more than 800 people jammed into the Centennial Missionary Baptist Church there, and we had to push our way through the police to get inside. I was sitting on the stage waiting to speak when the bomb came flying through an open window. It hit a man on the head, bounced off a lady's hand, then rolled to the middle of the floor. I just sat there, frightened, and saw my wife and my kids and everything decent in my life, and wondered why I was sitting there, fixing to die and leave all that, and it flashed through my mind that it was worth it. When I looked up, I saw the reporters and the photographers standing still, writing in their notebooks and taking their pictures, while hundreds of Negroes around them were on their feet running for the door. I jumped up and grabbed the microphone. "Where are you going?" "The man who threw it is outside God's house. The man who's supposed to save you lives here." They stopped in their tracks. Somebody picked up the bomb and threw it back out the window. I walked outside the church after a while and looked at the cops lounging around outside, leaning on the hoods of their cars in the evening, talking softly and laughing. I walked across the street and into a Negro grocery store to make a phone call. The police commissioner was in there. He didn't know who I was yet. "Hey, boy, come over here." "Yes, sir." "You just come from the church, huh? That Gregory's in there. He funny, boy?" How could any man be funny when a dumb superintendent of police lets these heathen cops do the things they do? He got red and walked out. I went back to the church. We found out that the bomb had been a special U.S. Army gas grenade, more powerful than tear gas, which could have killed the people nearby had it gone off. Whoever threw the bomb forgot to pull the pin, and people were surprised a few months later when they blew up that church in Birmingham. We held our meeting and I spoke. The Clarksdale Negroes weren't as responsive as the Greenwood Negroes because they were more scared of the police, of losing their jobs, and they were all pretty shook up by the grenade. When the meeting was over, a man came in to tell me that I was going to be killed that night. A roadblock had been set up for me on the highway back to Greenwood. The messenger was a Negro, but he said he had been sent by the police commissioner. Outside the church, I could hear one of the police officers screaming, almost hysterical. "If one of our men threw that bomb, you better believe it would have gone off. We don't make mistakes like that. No, sir, we don't. Our boys don't miss. No, we don't." The folks from the church made a ring around Jim Sanders and me and took us around the corner. We ducked into the drugstore owned by Aaron Henry, the powerful Negro leader, and lay there for an hour until a car was brought up to the back door. Jim and I crouched in the back of the car, and we were taken to the home of a Clarksdale Negro. We didn't sleep that night, lying on the floor of the house, keeping away from the windows. The Negro had a telephone, and we weren't sure just how afraid he was and who he was afraid of. We stayed awake to make sure nobody used that phone that night. In the morning, we were driven back to Greenwood along side roads. They knocked down that 98-year-old lady that day, right in the streets, and I'll never forget the way she looked up at me from the gutter, her head bleeding. "Don't let them make you mad, honey. They ain't after me. It's you they after." They arrested Jim that day, the first time he ever went to jail. I told the press I thought it was a good experience for him, make him a better writer. But I was worried. He's such a sweet, patient, good-natured man. They hauled 18 other Negroes away, bouncing one kid along the pavement, slamming another down on the floor of a bus. They grabbed the Reverend Robert Kinlock so hard his collar came off. One cop threw his club at a registration worker who was taking pictures. It only hit his shoulder. And the police were on their best behavior that day because there were FBI agents in town with movie cameras. They wouldn't arrest me, shoved me a little and pushed me around some, and got mad when I started bad-mouthing Hammond, but they had decided that putting me in jail would bring too much publicity. One cop came up to me and spat right in my face. I started to jump him, but I remembered what I had promised the old man, and I held myself back. Just stood there and let the spit run down my face and into my mouth. "I guess that makes me as white as you now, boy. I got your spit inside me." It was another long day. I called Lil, who had just come home from the hospital, and told her to take the plane on down. I wanted her to see the beauty of this Southern Negro, the old people learning to read and write, young and old marching, the women cooking all day, so there would always be food ready on the chance a demonstrator might run in for a bite to eat. Lil said she'd be down by morning. That third day in Greenwood, Wednesday, turned into night, and I was alone and scared. You never know what fear is until you walk through the streets of a quiet town at night, and it suddenly dawns on you that if anyone attacked you, you couldn't even call the police. You know, if you tripped on a curb and broke your ankle, when the ambulance pulled up and found out who you were, it would drive away or run you over. It's a feeling that takes all the guts out of you. And on you walk and pace the streets because you have no place to sleep. You're afraid to go into a Negro home. They might see you go in there and blow the house up, and you have no right to take a chance with someone else's family. Or it might be the house of a very scared Negro, and he might tell them where you are. I thought about St. Louis and how we used to rap for Mr. Roosevelt every night, and how he once said that there was nothing to fear but fear itself. And I said, bullshit, out loud. Sometimes it makes you feel a little better to talk to the dark. Bullshit. I walked around the corner with my head down, and when I looked up, I saw one of the most vicious white men I ever saw in my life. A big fat man with a bald head and tobacco juice running out of his mouth. He swung that double-barrel shotgun like it was a toy. It was no toy. He stuck it right into my stomach. I'm going to blow your black nigger guts out. And I was too tired and too gut scared to move. Then I felt that goddamn monster rise up, and I looked in his eye. Is that all you plan to do, boy? Just kill me? Pull that fucking trigger, boy. You just pull that fucking trigger. And that no good dirty motherfucker was so hung up on his hate weed that he lowered his shotgun and turned and walked away. He just couldn't do anything a Negro told him to do. On Thursday and Friday, I marched with Lil. To the cops, she was just another demonstrator, another face in the crowd. A lot of people said I was crazy to have her come down, but I wanted to share this thing with her. I wanted her to see this beauty and ugliness. We stayed in the home of Reverend Tucker. The police harassment picked up, and the television people started asking us to demonstrate early so they could make the 6 o'clock news with their film clips. As it turned out, we didn't do much more demonstrating. When the police began taking pictures of the marchers, I turned the group back. The police would use the pictures to permanently blackball and harass the local Negroes. And I didn't want that to happen. They would have to stay in Greenwood long after we left. I left Greenwood on Saturday morning, April 6th. Things had quieted down. Deals had been made. The demonstrators were released from jail, and the city promised to supply the Negroes with buses so they wouldn't walk through their town on their way to the courthouse to register. In return, a federal injunction against local harassment was dropped, and I promised to leave town. I had learned a lot, and I felt so much stronger now, less afraid, like a soldier who has been through his first battle. A lot happened down there that I'll never know about. A lot happened that I can't talk about now because this war is still going on. And when I got back north, a lot happened that scared me all over again in a different way. I found out, for example, that some of the northern press had reported that the bomb in Clarksdale was only a football bladder. And some had reported that we had lost in Greenwood, and I had played the fool. I knew it couldn't have been the newsmen who had been down there, but it was editors up north who turned and twisted the stories that were sent to them. But what scared me most was when Negroes asked me if it was true that I had gone down to Greenwood for publicity. And it dawned on me that any time you help a Negro in America, even the Negroes will question your intentions. I could have quit show business and joined the Peace Corps and gone to Vietnam, and no one, white or black, would have questioned why I did it. But to help Negroes, I was beginning to realize what a long, hard road it would be. Chapter 2. It's a great thing to go to jail for right, but whether you're there for right or wrong, when you hear that big steel door close and that key turn, you know you're there. That was Birmingham, May of 1963. Martin Luther King asked me to come down. I arrived at 11:30 a.m. on a Monday, and an hour and a half later, I went to jail with more than 800 other demonstrators. It was my first time in jail to stay. You Dick Gregory? I'm Mr. Gregory. Somebody snatched my collar, and my feet didn't hit the floor again until I was in solitary confinement. Later in the afternoon, I was brought downstairs and put in a cell built for 25 people. There must have been 500 of us in there. When they moved us out to eat, the corridors were so crowded you couldn't walk. Just stand still and let the crowd move you along. The last one back in the cell didn't have a place to lie down and sleep. There was a little boy, maybe 4 years old, standing in the corner of the cell sucking his thumb. I felt sorry for him. He didn't even have someone his age to play with. I kind of rubbed his head and asked him how he was. "All right," he said. "What are you here for?" "Teed him." He couldn't even say freedom, but he was in jail for it. The older kids sang church songs, sitting and waiting for the night to pass away. None of us knew how long we were going to be in jail. We were hoping new people would come in with information about the movement outside. We didn't really know, squatting there in that Birmingham jail, that the first really great battle of the revolution was going on outside. That a man named Bull Connor was becoming a symbol to the world of how low and vicious and stupid one American could be to another. That an Alabama city was becoming a symbol to the world of the cancer eating away at our country. On the other side of that wall were dogs and fire hoses and guns and clubs, and the blood of black men and white men, good men and bad men of both colors, and children and women and old people. We were in the battle, but the rest of the world outside that jail saw more than we did. Bombs and soldiers and killings. And some of them outside were horrified that Martin Luther King used little children, and some of them understood that freedom was for little black children too. That in an all-out war for survival, there are no civilians. There were little children in Hiroshima. The jailers fed us in the morning, and it tasted good because some of us hadn't eaten in 24 hours. They harassed us too, and that second day they opened the cell door and tried to reach in and pull some of the kids out. The kids wouldn't go, and we were trying to close the door while the guards were trying to open it. Part of my arm was hanging outside the bars, and one of the guards slammed down on it with his billy club. Before I could remember about nonviolence, I threw the door open and jumped out after him, right into the arms of 5 guards. It was the first really good beating I ever had in my life, a professional job, end to end, up and down. They didn't miss a spot. It didn't really start hurting until about midnight when I tried to touch my face, and I couldn't get my arm up that high. What the hell? If you're willing to die for freedom, you have to be willing to take a beating. For a couple of days, though, I thought that dying was probably easier. It was just body pain, though. The Negro has a callus growing on his soul, and it's getting harder and harder to hurt him there. That's a simple law of nature. Like a callus on a foot and a shoe that's too tight. The foot is nature's, and that shoe was put on by man. That tight shoe will pinch your foot and make you holler and scream, but sooner or later, if you don't take the shoe off, a callus will form on the foot and begin to wear out the shoe. It's the same with the Negro in America today. That shoe, the white man's system, has pinched and rubbed and squeezed his soul until it almost destroyed him. But it didn't, and now a callus has formed on his soul, and unless that system is adjusted to fit him too, that callus is going to wear out that system. I thought about that for 5 days in the Birmingham jail while Martin Luther King was waking up America. Chapter 3. The nightclub audiences were a little more respectful when I came back from Birmingham. After Greenwood, there had been hecklers who accused me of demonstrating for publicity. After Birmingham, people came backstage to shake my hand and God bless me and tell me to keep up the good work, white and black. I was surprised. I had thought that being in jail and getting beaten up would cool me off in show business. I began taking more and more time off, flying to fundraising benefits, to rallies, to meetings. In May, I opened at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco, and I wasn't there long before the demonstrations began in Jackson, Mississippi. Medgar Evers was the key man down there, and I called him to ask if I could help. In many ways, Medgar was the man responsible for my being in the civil rights fight. If he hadn't invited me down to Jackson in 1962, I would never have met the old man who lost his wife, and I would never have heard of Clyde Kennard. Medgar asked me to come. I went to Enrico Banducci, the owner of the Hungry Eye, and I told him I wanted to leave, that my people needed me. A white man, and he had waited all year for my engagement, but he never batted an eye. I admire you, Greg. Good luck. It was that last night in San Francisco, a Saturday night, that I first felt death. Just a funny little feeling in my stomach, a sixth sense that said someone was going to die. I called my lawyer to make sure my will was in order. Then I flew to Chicago to talk to Lil. If I was killed in Jackson, I didn't want my children raised with hate. She sat on the couch, her eyes wide and tearful, and I told her what I wanted my children to hear. Just tell them that Daddy was doing right. Tell them it takes a strong soldier to fight when he's outnumbered and the other side has all the dogs, all the fire hoses, all the prods. Don't let them come up with hate, Lil. Just show them the beauty in what their daddy was doing. I went into the bedroom and I kissed Michelle and Lynn, and I kissed Richard Claxton Gregory Jr. He was 2.5 months old, and I hadn't had time to know him. Jim Sanders was waiting for me downstairs, and when I got there, I discovered a little switchblade knife in my pocket I had used in my act. I went back upstairs to leave it, and Lil was in the bathroom. Richard Jr. had soiled his diaper, and he was crying. I picked him up, and he stopped crying and smiled. Lil came in and smiled, too. "That's the first time you ever played with him, Greg." "There'll be time, honey. Time will come. We'll sit and talk father to son." I kissed him again and promised Lil I'd call as soon as I got to Jackson. I didn't. The demonstrators put Jim and me up at a Negro minister's house Sunday morning. I figured I'd call later from a pay booth. Jim and I had just gone to sleep when the phone rang. It was Medgar Evers. "Greg, you better call home." I got chills. His voice sounded just like Doc Lingle's when the coach came to the movie theater that night Mama died. "What happened?" "I don't know. Just call home. Your son's sick." "No, Medgar, he's not sick. I just held him last night." "Call home, Greg." "Why?" "Just call home, Greg." "Medgar." "I'm sorry, Greg. Your son is dead." I was numb and I was sick, but there was still hope. Until Lil answered the phone, hysterical. "I'll be right home, honey. I love you so much." I called Medgar back and told him I was sorry, that I knew what he was doing in Jackson was more important to America than my son dying, but I was leaving. He said he understood. Jim and I left our clothes in Jackson and flew back to Chicago. It was a very short flight because I didn't know how I was going to face Lil, a woman who had to be mother and father to her children because her husband was a stranger in the house. And I couldn't understand how I had been so sure that I was going to be killed in the heat of battle, only to find out that someone safe and protected had died. Lil was sitting on the couch when I came in the door. Bob Johnson, editor of Jet magazine, was with her. Her eyes came alive for a second when I walked in. Then they went dead again. I started toward her, and the phone rang. It was a long-distance call from Alabama. Collect. I accepted the charges. It was a white woman.
"Mr. Gregory?"
Yes, ma'am. I just heard on the radio your son died, and let me tell you, it serves you right. I'm real glad that happened. You coming down here where you don't belong and stirring up all. I'm glad too. I had $5 million worth of insurance on him. There was a long silence, and then she said, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. It was a very long night. Sometimes I got through to Lil for a few minutes, but mostly she just sat still, her hands in her lap, staring at the wall. When she talked, her voice was chilly and far away. It was always the same story. She had gone to bed at midnight the night before, soon after I left. At 4 a.m., she woke up to give Richard a feeding. He was the healthiest of all the babies, the best eater. She went back to sleep, knowing that he would wake her at 8 a.m. with his crying, like he always did. But he didn't, and she woke up with a start at 9, ran in and picked him up. He was warm, but dead. She ran into the hallway screaming, and the neighbors called the fire department. They brought an inhalator. One of the doctors at the hospital said he thought it was a kind of overnight pneumonia, a common thing with babies. Later we found out he was right. Thousands of babies die every year that way. There were a lot of phone calls that night, all kinds. Most were sympathetic. Some were cruel and asked for Richard Jr. Some were from ministers because it was suddenly open season on Dick Gregory. It would be a big prestige move to get his son's funeral. One minister taped his 5-minute radio show and came by the house just in time to turn the radio on and sit in my living room and listen to himself talk about Dick Gregory's heavy moments. I asked Bob Johnson to get a minister who wouldn't turn the funeral into a carnival, who wouldn't try to take Richard Jr. to heaven right in the funeral parlor. He called the Reverend Mack. The phone rang again. Greenwood. He had a southern dialect, and for a moment I thought he was a Negro. Mr. Gregory? Yeah? When you coming back down here? First chance I get. How come you ain't in Jackson now? I heard someone whisper on the other end of the line. Ask him about his son. Ask him about his son. I knew they were white. How's your son, Mr. Gregory? Just fine, just fine. How come you ain't in Jackson now? Didn't feel like going down. You know how us niggas are lazy. Thought you were in Jackson this morning. Oh man, how can you be so dumb? How could I be in Jackson this morning and talk to you from Chicago tonight? You know, white boy, niggas are scared of airplanes. Mr. Gregory, tell me some jokes. Listen, white boy, us niggas up north are more sophisticated than you white folks down there. We never work after 11:30 at night. You have to call me back during my working hours. For some reason, when they didn't hear the cry for pity or sympathy or tolerance in my voice, they became ashamed. In their own little way, they said they were sorry. Good night, Mr. Gregory, the voice said softly, and the line went dead. I went back to Lil. I told her about the phone calls. It upset her. She started to sob. Now you understand when I say this thing is bigger than you or me or the kids. When a grown man will call and ask to talk to Richard Jr., you know this thing is bigger than all of us. She said she understood. Then her mind wandered away again. Michelle and Lynn were very quiet, taking care of each other in another room. Lil hadn't told them yet, and I took Michelle into the bathroom. Michelle, honey, where's Richard? Richard's gone, Daddy. Gone where? To the hospital. When will he be back? He's not coming back, Daddy. You'll have to get another Richard. How do you know? I looked at Mommy's face. It was midnight then, just 24 hours since I held him in my arms. I wanted to get back to Jackson, back to the demonstrations, but I had a woman here who was losing her mind. I talked to the minister and told him to go ahead and make the arrangements. I said good night to Bob Johnson, and I put the girls to bed. Now I've got to take care of Lil, and I have to do it fast so I can get back to Jackson with a clear mind. I walked into our room, and she was lying across the bed, looking at the ceiling. Richard's blanket was clenched to her breast. I decided to take a chance on pulling her out of her shock fast or pushing her deeper in. I knelt next to the bed. Lil, can I talk to you? I touched her and she jerked away. Lil, he was my son too. Can I share it with you? Just a little. She looked at me and held the look for the first time since I had gotten into town. She grabbed my hand. You remember how I thought I was going to be killed in Jackson? Yeah. Remember how I came the long way through Chicago to explain not to bring the kids up with hate, and how for the first time I picked Richard Jr. up and hugged him and kissed him and played with him? Yes, yes. I kissed him and said that Daddy's going to make it a better world for you, not knowing that his world would be over in a few hours, right? Yes. Honey, I left here and went to Mississippi last night, knowing it was very easy for me to get killed, thinking I was going to get killed. You know, Lil, if you had been sick, if Richard had been sick and they called me to come out of the South, I never would have come, right? Yes. Remember last year when you had the miscarriage and there was trouble in New Orleans? I just put a blank check in your hand as they were wheeling you out of the house because I had a plane to catch. You know that nothing short of death would have pulled me out of the South today. Yes, Greg, I know that. Good, honey, because I wonder if it ever dawned on you that maybe if I hadn't come out of the South today, I would have been killed. No, it didn't. Well, does it make sense to you? Yes. You know, Lil, maybe this is the work of God. Maybe to spare my life, he took our son's life. Do you believe God could do something like that? Yes. And then I grabbed her hand hard because I was ready to do the most awful thing I had ever done in my life. I held her hand and looked into her eyes. Forget about God. I want you to make the choice. What do you mean, Greg? You have the decision now, Lil. Forget about God. If you have the decision to make this morning that I was to be killed in Mississippi and the only way you could spare my life was to take Richard's, which one of us would you have taken? I knelt there and I looked at a woman's face that was so distorted it wasn't even human. A face with two holes for eyes that were filled with hate for me. She jerked and twisted, and I jumped up and pinned her down on the bed and I screamed at her. Forget about God. It's your decision. You make the decision. Me or Richard Jr. Me or Richard Jr. And she twisted and rolled and tried to get free and screamed and kicked. And then suddenly she went limp. For the first time her eyes were clear and her body relaxed and the tears rolled freely down her cheeks. Richard Jr., she said. After the funeral, Jim Sanders and I went back to Jackson. All the way down, I wondered if I had a right to shock a woman out of crying, out of a grief a mother has to feel when her only son dies in the same room. And because Lil had pulled out of it so strongly, and because I was now away from it all, I think I went into shock myself, realizing for the first time what had happened. Over and over again I thought about that feeling of death I had, and how it was my little baby, safe and sound, not a soldier on the battle line who had died. Then we were in Mississippi again. We didn't stay long this time. There was a strangeness in the air. The demonstrations weren't going well. Kids were coming to demonstrate and they were being sent back to get notes from their parents. I saw two young Negroes, one a soldier, walking on the streets, and I asked him why they weren't demonstrating. The soldier said because he was in the army. Sure, I told him, the same army that will send you all over the world to guarantee a foreigner his rights. His friend said he wasn't demonstrating because he was too violent. That's right, I told him. And when the doors of segregation get kicked down and they're ready to hire their first Negro detective, are you going to refuse the job because you're too violent? They both said they'd demonstrate. Lena Horne came down to speak, and that did a lot of good for the people, to hear someone they idolized say, "I'm with you." This is especially important in an area where the church is afraid to wake up and carry the ball. I talked to Medgar Evers, told him that something bad was going to happen in Jackson. Things seemed so wrong, but I didn't know what it was, and somehow there didn't seem to be anything I could do here. I remember Medgar cried. I guess he felt it too. I told him I was sorry to be leaving again, but he knew that any time he called me I would come back. Any time. He said he knew. We went back to San Francisco, started working again at the Hungry Eye. I apologized to Enrico Banducci for having left in the middle of an engagement, but I told him that as long as I stayed hot as a comic, I'd work for him every year. I don't know if my mind was really on my work those first 2 days at the Hungry Eye, thinking about Lil, about Medgar, about Richard Jr. Somehow I still couldn't understand that feeling I had a week before in San Francisco about death, about someone being killed. I was so sure it would be me, and then it turned out to be a little baby born in one of the world's best baby hospitals, born into money and love and care. It didn't make sense. And of course it didn't. The second night back at the Hungry Eye, Billy Daniels drove over from a singing engagement in Berkeley to tell me that Medgar Evers had been murdered. Chapter 4. When we walked behind the body of Medgar Evers through the streets of Jackson, the line stretched so far back it looked like ants in a parade. Old folks, young folks, black and light and white folks, nappy hair and pressed hair and blow hair, Tom McAn and Buster Brown and barefoot. They walked and they walked. It looked like we had enough folks to march on God that day. We turned a corner, and the same white policemen who had fought Medgar so hard were directing traffic at his funeral procession. They were holding up their white gloves, telling Whitey in his car he'd have to stop for Medgar Evers now. And Whitey sat in his car and watched the funeral go by. The same Whitey who didn't say a word when a man was fighting for right and truth and justice, who didn't open his mouth when that man was shot in the back in front of his house. And Whitey in his car had to be scared that day when he saw that procession go by, scared to realize that when you shoot right and truth and justice down, more right and truth and justice will rise up. It was hot that day, more than 100 degrees. I was wet from the cuffs of my pants to the lapels on my jacket, hot and wet inside my shoes. When I pulled out my handkerchief and squeezed it, water ran down my hand. The press was there that day, and I remember the way everybody gasped a little when a photographer from Life magazine almost stood on Medgar's coffin to get a picture of Mrs. Evers. I gasped too. But when I saw that picture, that beautiful picture of a single tear running down Mrs. Evers' face, I knew that photographer could have stood inside that coffin and it would have been all right. Jim Sanders and I went back to San Francisco and the Hungry Eye that night. Jim asked me how I could be funny that night. I told him that when a man sells his talents, he's a prostitute. And when you're a prostitute, you lay like the customer wants you to lay. I was funny that night. Chapter 5. It was like being in the forest in the daytime when the sun is shining and everybody's having picnics and laughing and playing ball, and then suddenly it's night and you're alone. You're running through the pitch black cold, running away from something that's whipping down on your head and shoulders, maybe running in the wrong direction, and your legs hurt and your stomach hurts, and it starts to rain hard and cold, and finally you can't run anymore and you lay down and say, "All right, catch me." And suddenly the rain quits and the sun comes out, and you see you've been running away from the branches of trees that look so friendly and beautiful in the sunshine again. The birds start singing and the rabbits start running. You just cock your hand under your head and lie there, and you can't hold back that smirky smile when a little squirrel comes over and licks your cheek and a little bird flies down on your chest. And you ask yourself, what was I so afraid of a few minutes ago? And then suddenly it's pitch black cold again, and you're running again, and you know the answer. That was the summer of 1963. The summer began in St. Louis, a week after Medgar Evers' funeral. The AAU was holding its national track and field championships and selecting a team to compete against the Russian team in Moscow. I asked the Negro athletes to boycott the Moscow meet. I told them I'd rather see this country embarrassed than destroyed. They didn't understand. I talked to them, I negotiated with them, I stood on street corners and passed out handbills. I screamed at them, "Damn you, listen! An American Negro can go to Moscow and run in an integrated track meet on enemy territory, but he can't run in an integrated track meet in parts of his own home country. You can bust this thing if you want to. It's one thing you defend your country in a track meet, that's fine, but you have a chance to save your country." But they were young. They didn't want to embarrass their country, to bring this thing into the open, to push this thing out on an international level. They couldn't seem to understand that if Khrushchev came to this country with his Russian track team and demanded that the meet be held in New Orleans, he would beat us because no Negroes could compete. I flew back from the track meet in St. Louis disgusted and downhearted. Those athletes could have saved it right there. They would have embarrassed this country so bad it would have cleaned house. But they didn't, and so this country just swept a little more filth under the rug and didn't look to see that the other end was on fire. After the failure in St. Louis, I took Lil and the kids to Honolulu for a vacation. Over there you can think, you can try to seek wisdom, you can reach out and touch nature. I went to rest and I ended up doing a couple of benefit performances and radio shows. They told me there was a little racial prejudice in Hawaii, like a woman is just a little bit pregnant. When we came back to Chicago, there was a letter waiting for me that brought tears to my eyes. I had made Who's Who in America. That's why so many people are willing to lay down their lives to save this great country from the cancer of hate that is destroying it. Where else in the world could a Negro, born and raised on relief, make Who's Who? In 1952, I was a welfare case, and in 1963, I was on a list of famous men. In America, with all of its evils and faults, you can still reach through the forest and see the sun. But we don't know yet whether the sun is rising or setting for our country. I lay on the couch in our living room and I read and I reread that letter from Who's Who, and I cried, and I was thrilled, and I felt strong. I turned on the radio and heard that they were demonstrating in Chicago for better schools, and that they had arrested some people. I called James, and Lil and I got dressed and went downtown. In Chicago, they arrested us for disorderly conduct. In Birmingham and Jackson, anywhere in the South I've been arrested, it's been for parading without a permit. In my own town in the North, I found less dignity and less truth than I found in Mississippi. In the South, we were treated as demonstrators, as bad as that might be, and kept together with other demonstrators. In Chicago, we were treated as convicts. Our clothes were pulled off, our belongings were taken away. We might have had a very bad time in prison if the authorities were in control, but the convicts ran that prison, and they were sympathetic. I guess they had never seen people brought into the House of Correction who refused to post bond and who were being jailed for right. It leaves a bitter taste in your mouth to see Negro policemen arresting Negro and white civil rights demonstrators in the North, but it makes you sick to the stomach to see what really goes on in these northern jails. I had never been with convicts before. I couldn't believe that they ran the prison, that if you wanted cigarettes or a clean shirt or a telephone call to the outside, you just had to go through one of the convict leaders. I think you could have gotten more pure heroin in that Chicago jail than on a South Side street. Any prisoner who didn't know how to lie and cheat and steal and threaten before he went to jail sure learned fast there. Many of them carry knives, and they fight like dogs over their women, the pretty younger homosexuals. We had some trouble in jail. Me, James, and a white demonstrator. First, they tried to make the white boy work in the junkyard, so James and I refused to go to our clerical jobs. We hadn't been sentenced yet, and so legally we didn't have to work off our sentences. We were thrown in solitary confinement. The convict leader was a Southern Negro who had been a pimp, robber, dope pusher, mugger. He had done a lot of reading because he had spent most of his life in jail. In a year, out a year, in again. He told me he was doing a life sentence on the installment plan. He came to see me in solitary, and he said he was impressed with the beauty and truth of the movement. He said he might not be in jail if there were equal rights. Then he said he'd get me out of solitary. I just thanked him. I didn't believe he could. I had a lot to learn about prisons. That evening, after dinner, the convict leader went right up to the chief security officer. "Eat your last can of sauerkraut, Polak, because one of us has to die unless Mr. Gregory and his people get out of solitary." We were taken out of solitary. It was the trial that really bothered me. It was supposed to be a short bench trial, and it lasted all day. It was the first time I had ever been on trial in the North, and the first time the police ever lied on me. I guess in the South they don't have to. The cops call you nigger, the judge calls you nigger, and everybody knows you're going to get time. But up north, where they can't come out and call you nigger, they have to go through the motions of a fair trial. They lied from the beginning of that trial to the end. I cried. One of the Chicago policemen accused Jim Sanders of talking back to him and raising his hand to him. Another swore that they had made no arrest until I showed up and the crowd at the demonstration site got out of hand. It was brought out in the trial that the complaint against me had never been signed. 11 days in prison, and the complaint hadn't been signed. The judge adjourned the trial, and then he refused to rule on the case. And then he turned me loose. Back to Mayor Richard J. Daley's corrupt Chicago. Massa Daley's plantation, as us slaves call it. Then I went out to Los Angeles for a nightclub engagement, but I flew back east for one day, the day that turned that summer into a beautiful thing. that turned the darkness of the forest into daylight, the day we marched on Washington. That was a glory day. For the first time in history, the policy wheel closed down in Washington, and one of the classiest, richest whores in the country asked me to lend her $30. She said she wanted to go to Washington with clean money. Whitey expected violence, and he had a picnic on his hands. Couldn't understand how a people with a 300-year-old gripe could gather together in one place without breaking heads. Wars have started over weekend border disputes. Oh baby, we came with brand new shoes and wigs and Sunday clothes because it was the first time all of us, not just Mr. Nobel Prize winner or Mr. Big Entertainer, were ever invited somewhere. I brought Lil and the kids. I didn't want them to miss a part of the 20th century. When we got off the plane, I was so nervous and proud, I rushed right to the hotel and changed suits. I didn't want to wear a wrinkled one. Ozzie Davis had asked me to help him MC the television part of the show, but I turned him down. There was some bad feeling among whites toward me for demonstrating, and I didn't want to bug anyone in their living room that day. I didn't want the least little thing to mar this beautiful day, and you can believe I wanted to stand up before that audience. We watched the people walking through the streets, a rabbi with a sign written in Hebrew, and just from the expression on his face, you knew that sign said something nice. Saw a man bump into another man, and they both said, "Excuse me." Martin Luther King had told us not to put mayonnaise on our chicken because he didn't want anyone passing out. And we didn't put mayonnaise on our chicken. And we put those chicken bones in our pockets. Oh baby, to stand on top of the Lincoln Memorial and look down, it was like everyone in the world was standing there, smiling in the sunshine and singing. Saw Negroes and whites in their best clothes, with their best manners, on their best behavior. And the Negroes, people that Whitey says don't qualify for first-class citizenship, demonstrated to the world that day that we're more first class than a lot of whites. And Bayard Rustin, the man who engineered that march. When will Whitey realize that men like Rustin can help him solve his world problems? They came over to me and asked me to say a few words. I told them I didn't want to. They insisted. I was really happy they did. I said a few humorous words, then went to sit on the grass with my family. The climax of that beautiful day was Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream." Never have so many people cried, whether they wanted to or not. When it was all over, I just sat there because I didn't know which way to go. Thought of 1,000,001 things. Oh, how my mind wandered that glorious day. That day I felt like the Negro had been given his equal rights. I felt that way right into September, right into the Sunday morning when the forest turned pitch black cold again. Someone threw a bomb in a Negro church in Birmingham. 4 kids were dead. Chapter 6. Another funeral. It wasn't like Medgar Evers' funeral. This one was by invitation only. But they came anyway, the poor, the raggedy, the verb buster. Outside the church, I saw an old Negro woman in torn tennis shoes holding onto an old Negro man who had a wine bottle in his pocket. I was glad when the television cameras took pictures of that old couple. Those kids died for all Negroes, not just those who were invited. But I guess the greatest lesson of that Birmingham bombing was for the Negro who thought that civil rights didn't pertain to him. The principal, the teacher, the doctor, the preacher, the lawyer. Those were his kids in that church. And whether he wanted to demonstrate or not, whether he thought we were going too fast or not, he found out that as long as your skin is black. 3 of the children lay inside the church. I talked to one of the mothers. Both of her daughters were in the bombing. One daughter got glass in her eyes, and the mother spent 5 hours in a hospital operating room waiting to find out if she would ever see again. A few minutes after she learned that one daughter would not be blind for life, she learned that her other daughter was dead. After a while, Lil and I walked over to the church that had been bombed. We saw a strange and terrible thing. All the windows but one had been completely blown out. The stained glass window of Christ was almost intact. Only Christ's eyes and the top of his head were blown out, and it frightened me because I wondered what it meant. Christ with no eyes? The blind leading the blind? Christ with no mind? We left, and I told Lil that she had seen a great work of art because it had taken 100 years of hate and violence to produce an artist capable of creating that picture. But it wasn't the only frightening symbol I saw in Birmingham that day. I saw a state policeman with a Tommy gun cradled in his arm, a smile on his face, leaning against a mailbox across the street from the church. The mailbox was painted red, white, and blue. Chapter 7. A scared Negro is one thing. A mad Negro is something else. I had always gone down south scared, but in September, when I went down to Selma, Alabama, Whitey had a mad Negro in his hands. Those brave, beautiful kids from SNCC had started their big voter registration drive in Selma and had asked me to come help them. I was too sick to travel, but I didn't want to let them down. I sent Lillian in my place. She was pregnant again. We didn't know it at the time, but she was carrying twin girls. Lillian was in jail a week before I was able to get to Selma. It was a Friday night. I talked to Lillian through a jailhouse window, and she said everything was all right. Then I went to speak at a rally. I walked through a deputized posse of 200 rednecks into a church that had been tear-gassed a few days before. I got up on stage in front of a crowd of scared Negroes. They needed some courage. Courage to go out and buck the system. Courage to let their children demonstrate. Courage to stand up and be counted in a town where the front row of their church was filled that night with policemen pretending to be newspaper reporters and taking notes. I directed my speech at those cops in the front row. I was mad. I told that audience how surprised I was to see a dumb Southern cop who knew how to write. The crowd was nervous. They had never heard such talk in front of a white man before. It always amazes me to see how the Southern white folks will knock themselves out, pose as all kinds of things to slip into a Negro meeting, and we haven't gotten around to wanting to slip into a Ku Klux Klan meeting. I think that speaks for itself. The whole world wants to slip in and be around right and good and godliness, but only fools want to be around filth. They looked at each other and giggled nervously, but they sat up a little straighter. A Southern white man? Only thing he has to be able to identify with is a drinking fountain, a toilet, and the right to call me nigger. They liked that. A few people clapped and somebody yelled, "You tell him, brother." Every white man in America knows we are Americans, knows we are Negroes, and some of them know us by our names. So when he calls us a nigger, he's calling us something we are not, something that exists only in his mind. So if nigger exists only in his mind, who's the nigger? They laughed and they clapped. Now let's take it one step further. This is a Bible here. We know it's a book. Now if I sat here and called it a bicycle, I have called it something it's not. So where does the bicycle exist? In my mind. I'm the sick one, right? And they were cheering now and screaming and laughing, and the white cops up front looked pale. The crowd wasn't afraid of them. I talked for about an hour that Friday night. I told them how important it was for them to get out and support the voter registration drive on Monday. If they registered, they could vote. And if they voted, the politicians would represent their interests too. Saturday, Lillian came out of jail, and Saturday night I went back to the church to speak again. Before I began, I asked the audience to sing, "Were you there when they crucified the Lord?" Then I started, and I wasn't mad anymore, and I laid it down to them. It's amazing how we come to this church every Sunday and cry over the crucifixion of Christ, and we don't cry over these things that are going on around and among us. If he was here now and saw these things, he would cry. He would take those nails again for us, for this problem. It just so happened that in his day and time, religion was the big problem. Today, it is color. What do you think would happen to Christ tonight if he arrived in this town, a black man, and wanted to register to vote on Monday? What do you think would happen? Would you be there? You would. Then how come you're not out there with these kids? Because he said that whatever happens to the least happens to us all. Let's analyze the situation. We're not saying let's go downtown and take over City Hall. We're not saying let's stand on the rooftops and throw bricks at the white folks. We're not saying let's get some butcher knives and some guns and make them pay for what they've done. We're talking to the white man, and this is what we're saying. We're saying we want what you said belongs to us. You have a constitution. I'm a black man, and you make me sit down in a black school and take a test on the United States Constitution. A constitution that hasn't worked for anyone but you. And you expect me to learn it from front to back? So I learned it. You made me stand up as a little kid and sing "God Bless America" and "America the Beautiful" and all those songs the white kids were singing. I pledge allegiance to the flag. That's all I'm asking you for today. Something important happened in 1963, and the sooner we wake up and realize it, the better off this whole world is going to be, because for some reason God has put in your hands the salvation of not just America. This thing is bigger than just this country, but the salvation of the whole world. The Negro in America has the highest standard of living, the highest educational standard, the highest medical standard of any black man the world over, and of most white men outside America. And yet, there are backward countries getting more respect from this American white man than you people could ever command. Do you know why? It is because we grinned when he wanted us to grin. We cried when he wanted us to cry. We spent money when he wanted us to spend money. And we've done without when he said do without. He owns all the missiles in the world. And when he talks to you about owning a switchblade, you become ashamed. He started all the wars. And when he talks to you about cutting somebody on Saturday night, you become ashamed. He makes me feel small. He calls me everything on the job but my name. So I'm aggravated before I get home. Then he tells me about my education. Well, if it takes education, his style, to produce a clown that would throw dynamite in church, I hope we never get that. I have a newspaper, and I wish I brought it tonight. It embarrasses me just to look at it. It's a newspaper from 1848, a New Orleans newspaper. On the back page are ads offering rewards for the return of runaway slaves. Can you believe in 1848 we were running away, rebelling, and we didn't have any place to run to? 1848. Slaves were running away. Can you imagine what this old Negro had to go through? Can you imagine the day a Negro woman went to a black man and said, "Honey, I'm pregnant," and both of them fell on their knees and prayed that their baby would be born deformed? Can you imagine what this Negro went through, hoping his baby is born crippled? Because if he has been born crippled, he would have less chance of being a slave and more chance of having freedom. Think about that. Think about the woman you love coming to you and saying she's pregnant with your baby, and you both pray the baby is born crippled. This is what the slaves went through. And 100 years later, we have parallels. 100 years later, and you people are worrying about your kids being in jail overnight. Being in jail because they demonstrated for freedom. So many parents who don't even know where their kids are for the first time, they'll know where their kids are 24 hours a day. In jail. And now that they're there for a good cause and a good reason. How many mothers let their sons play football, and all he can get from that is a chance to help his team win a victory that will be forgotten tomorrow. So can't you let your son fight for freedom, something that the whole world will profit from forever? Sometimes I wonder how much this system has corrupted us. Sometimes I wonder, when will we wake up to see that the day is over when we can say, I'm not involved? Those 4 kids who were killed in that church in Birmingham, they weren't demonstrating. You don't have to participate. Just be black or be white and for our cause. When the bomb is thrown, somebody has to die. And do you know that 50% of the killings are our fault? That's right. We let this white man go crazy on us instead of straightening him out when we should have. Each one of us scratched our heads 5 years too long. Sure, timing was good once upon a time. That's how we got here. The old folks knew that was the only way they could raise you. What we call Uncle Tomism today was nothing but finesse and tact then. The old folks had to scratch their heads and grin their ways into a white man's heart. A white man who wouldn't accept them any other way. But at what point do we stop timing? A Negro is better off going to a foreign country fighting for America than he is coming to the South fighting for the Negro cause. When he is in a foreign country fighting to give those people rights he doesn't even get, the whole of America is behind him. When he comes down here, there are only a few behind him. So it's coming down to this. You have to commit. You're going through the same thing today that the folks went through when the Lord was crucified. Who else is with Christ? The Romans asked. And everybody just stood there and prayed silently. And they went back and said, I prayed. No, sister, I didn't even see your lips move. Were you there when they crucified the Lord? It's a nice song to sing, but this time you have an opportunity to be there. Sure, it would be a heck of a thing 20, 30 years from now when they're singing a song about these days and your grandkids and great-grandkids can stand up and say, yeah, baby, he was there. My grandfather was there. And when they ask you, you can nod your head and say, yeah, I was there. I'd like to tell you a story before I leave. I talked to the father of one of the kids who died in that church in Birmingham. He said to me, you know, Gregory, my daughter begged me to let her demonstrate, and I told her no. I told her she was too young. And she looked at me and she said, then you do it, Daddy. And that's what that man will have to live with for the rest of his life. Because if Birmingham had had enough Negroes behind them, there wouldn't have been a bombing. These kids here in Selma aren't doing anything just for themselves. There's nothing selfish about what they're doing here. Freedom will run all over this town, but you have to get behind them because there are too many white folks in front of them. Get behind your kids in this town. Goodbye, and God bless you, and good night. The next morning, Lil and I went home. It's hard to say goodbye to people in the South, people you're leaving behind on the battle line. They have that look in their eyes. Thanks a million, please don't go. They were singing, We Shall Overcome, as we drove out of Selma, and somehow we could still hear them on the plane back to Chicago. That Sunday, we took the kids to a drive-in movie. Michelle and Lynn sat in the back of the car, one on each side of Lil. On the way, Michelle pointed out the window. "What's that, Mommy?" "That's a filling station, Michelle. It sells gasoline." "Daddy's car runs on gasoline. All cars run on gasoline. Look over there, Michelle, across the street. There's another filling station. You see, honey, there are different kinds of gas. There's Shell, and over there, that's Standard. And now look over there." I'm driving with tears in my eyes. Here's a woman who just spent 8 days in jail, and she's able to sit back there, so patient and kind, and tell her kids about the different kinds of gasoline. I wish I had that kind of beauty. I wish the world was that free from malice and hate. Chapter 8. They burst into my hotel room, a dozen of them, laughing and screaming and singing, and for a moment all I saw were the flickering flames the first one was carrying in his hands. I jumped up and my stomach turned over, and then I was angry because they had scared me, and then I cried. It was a cake with candles. It was my first birthday party. I was 31. Jim Sanders was there, and his new wife Jackie, and my managers and agents and writers, and some of the other performers from the nightclub. We drank and we talked, and they didn't believe this was my first real party. And I told them about Richard, the kid I once knew in St. Louis, who used to buy himself a Twinkie cupcake and steal a little pink candle and pretend he was having a party. Oh, Mama, I wish you could see your little Richard now. He's all right. I didn't lie to you, Mama, about people buying me birthday presents, about people inviting me over to their houses. It's true now, so it's no lie anymore. And you know, Mama, that old lady who saw a star in the middle of my forehead, she was right. We thought I was going to be a great athlete, and we were wrong. And I thought I was going to be a great entertainer, and that wasn't it either. I'm going to be an all-American citizen, first class. Hot damn, we're going to bust this thing. I feel it when I stand in front of a crowd of people hungry for freedom, and I feel it when we march down the street for our rights. Hot water seeping up into a cold body, that dry taste in my mouth, the monster. But it's not content to beat some other's son in a foot race anymore, and it's not satisfied to make people laugh and love me. Now it wants some respect and dignity, and it wants freedom. It's willing to die for freedom. It's getting stronger every day. It would frighten you, Mama, but now it has truth and justice and the Constitution of the greatest country in the world on its side. It's not just a Negro monster. I saw it in a northern white boy who marched with us for freedom through the snow in Georgia. He had no soles on his shoes, and his feet were blue, and he never said a word. I asked him why he didn't go home and take that big engineering job he had been offered. He said that there would be nothing to build on unless every American citizen got his rights first. When I saw him, Mama, I laughed at every northern liberal who ever said, "Slow down, you people. Don't alienate your friends." Yeah, baby, were you there when they crucified the Lord, or were you just singing? Yeah, that monster's growing stronger, Mama. I saw it in New York, where we marched against school segregation, northern style, marched to give little black kids a chance for a better education and college and good jobs, and a chance for little white kids to sit with us and know us and learn to love and hate us as individuals, not just fear and hate us as a color like their parents do. I saw it in Chester, Pennsylvania, with Stanley Branch, where we marched for equal opportunities, a chance to be ordinary if we wanted, to be great if we could, just a chance to be Americans. I saw it in Atlanta, where we marched against segregation in restaurants. I was in my first sit-in there, and I did my first official negotiating. I learned that when honesty sits around a conference table, black men and white men can understand and feel each other's problems and help each other. I saw the monster in Mississippi, where we marched for voter registration so a Negro can cast his ballot for the government he lives under and supports with his tax money and dies for in wars. I saw it in San Francisco, where white doctors and lawyers marched on the lines with us and went to jail with us and showed the world that this isn't a revolution of black against white. This is a revolution of right against wrong, and right has never lost. This is a revolution. It started long before I came into it, and I may die before it's over, but we'll bust this thing and cut out this cancer. America will be as strong and beautiful as it should be for black folks and white folks. We'll all be free then, free from a system that makes a man less than a man, that teaches hate and fear and ignorance. You didn't die a slave for nothing, mama. You brought us up. You and all those Negro mothers who gave their kids the strength to go on, to take that thimble to the well while the whites were taking buckets. Those of us who weren't destroyed got stronger, got calluses on our souls, and now we're ready to change a system where a white man can destroy a black man with a single word: nigger. When we're through, mama, there won't be any niggers anymore. End of Nigger by Dick Gregory.